Hello traders, Day Trader Matt here with businesswithtrading.com doing an e-mini trading room recap for the 22nd of December, Monday. And today was another interesting day. As expected, was very choppy. And going into the largest holiday of the year, you would expect that. Most people are not trading, they've already left. And it just added to a lot of choppiness. We actually only made one trade today and pulled 1.5 points out. And the one trade we did take was a short over here, one even. And as the market came down, we kind of watched things, and we ended up getting out down here at 9.5. The market did come down. We were watching it, and we were trying to stop down at 9.5. The market did come back and hit us, and that was a level that I didn't really want to see hit. If the market was going down, it should have been able to continue. If not, then it would have just been ugly, like it actually turned out to be. The entire day. But anyway, it stopped us out. It came back up quite a bit. Chopped around a little more, came up, chopped around, and it was, definitely a little bit ugly. We tried to get in a couple spots, weren't able to, but I don't want to force things on a Monday of a holiday week, so I'm happy with today, and it's one of those days where, the entire month of December has been phenomenal, so to really argue about having sideways action on a day like today where most people expect sideways action. It's one of those things. Sometimes it's better to err on the side of caution than just to go all out, balls to the wall. And that was one of the, this was one of those days. I would rather just be cautious, going into a long holiday. We're already up phenomenally for the month. We can add a little bit more. This was one contract that we traded here, and we got 1.5 points for one contract. It's not the best trade in the world, but it's not horrible either. We made a little bit, and we ended up closing a little bit early as well, so not too bad. But anyway, I wanted to point out today, looking at today, yeah, I could see a couple areas where I could have, taken a trade, but in real time, it was very convoluted, in my opinion, and it was just one of those days that it was hideous all day, and that's why I always say, you have to be consistent. You want to make consistent profits, but you want to be consistent in the way that you approach the markets. You don't want to, add things one day, subtract things the next day, saying, well, I lost money this day, so maybe if I add, indicators A and B, maybe it won't be a loss anymore. And what I see a lot of new traders doing, some that have been around for a little while and that are struggling, but mostly new traders, they'll have a losing day and they'll add a couple indicators, and then they'll have maybe a couple wins or maybe a loss, and then they'll add a couple more, and then they'll subtract one and add one, and it just keeps going over and over. I had a question today, do I not use any indicators? And the term indicator, the stochastics and crap like that, different oscillators and stuff like that, I don't. Because I guess I'm kind of a purist in a sense, where I like to trade and I'm pretty good at it, but I don't add all this unnecessary stuff. Like price does one thing, and we can gather things from that. But if we add other things like stochastic or MACD or something like that, we already know what those are saying. We don't have to look at them because all they are what price has done in the past, and we know what it's done in the past. We can look at the chart and see. That's one thing that I go over. I hammer home in my trading course, and when I work with students, because you don't have to use unnecessary tools. It's like a carpenter is going out and he's going to frame a house. Basically, I think everybody knows what framing a house means. Basically he's building the walls out of wood. You set up the wood, and then once you set that up, then you can add all the insulation and the walls, the paneling and stuff like that. So he's out and he has his hammer. This is old school, 20 years ago. We'll pretend 20 years ago, where you actually had hammer and nails. So he has a hammer and nails, and it can be a he or a she. I don't really care. It's my analogy, but I don't really care how you guys perceive it. So anyway, there's a hammer and there's nails, but he has a rubber hammer and a regular hammer. One of those doesn't really need to be there. Why would you need a rubber hammer? So that's just an extra tool that you have to keep in your tool belt. It's just going to be awkward, carrying all that around. Anyone who's ever had a tool belt full of tools can, understand that. And trading's the same way. Adding these unnecessary indicators, oscillators, whatever you want to call them, I don't really care. I'm not a big person on terminology. It doesn't really matter to me. And once you've been trading for a certain amount of time, you'll get the same way. Terminology doesn't really matter. Who cares if it's called a limit order or stop order? It doesn't matter as long as you know how to use it. Or different stuff like that. It's semantics. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, and share what my feelings towards that. I don't. I'm not a big proponent of any of that. Using unnecessary tools and looking at different things that really just confuse you. Because it is scientifically proven, psychologically proven by neuroscientists, that the more stuff you look at, the worse your decision-making process is going to be, especially if they're contradictory. You're looking at a couple different things, stochastics and MACD and RSI, and they don't always move the same way, and sometimes you're going to have a setup, but you're going to have confliction in different indicators, and it's just going to cause the brain to make bad decisions. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Hopefully it made a little bit of sense. If you have any questions, you can always email me, support@abusinesswithtrading.com. A lot of people like to email me, and that's cool. If you want to email me, put a comment below the video. Most people email me. And either way you want to ask the question or give feedback or comments, I'm cool with whatever method you want to use. And I'm a firm believer, there's no such thing as a dumb question, only the one that's not asked. So if you have a question, ask away. Because I was once a new trader. I was once a horrible trader. I was probably worse than a lot of you out there listening to the video right now. But I was able to become good. And that's what, trading is. It's a skill that can be learned. Just like any skill out there, it can be learned. And that's the great thing about being a human being. We can learn anything. All we have to do is put in the effort to make it happen. So with that, thanks everybody for watching the video. Have an awesome rest of your day. And I'll see you back here in the markets. Thank you.